Good morning. My name is Jennifer Clemens, and I'm going to be presenting on the NGSSification of my ninth grade medical science class. Last year, for my year 3 action research project, this was the same general topic. My question last year was, how does NGSS and student-driven curriculum affect the level of student engagement and student performance in my class? Last year, the 2018-2019 school year, I modified my curriculum, started to work more towards NGSSification, and I looked at student engagement through surveys, especially looking at their attitudes towards science and towards my class and how it compared to classes in the past. And then I looked at student performance based on their grades. I compared the grades from science class with me that year to their 8th grade science class grades. When all was said and done at the end of the year, I basically found that grades and attitudes either largely stayed the same or decreased, which was unfortunate. But I also noticed that a large majority of students still stated in their surveys that they felt they were able to perform better in my class, that they were more engaged in my class, they enjoyed it, and they learned a lot. So the comments were validating overall, but I was still kind of left wondering about the actual NGSS standards. Did the NGSSification really increase engagement and performance? So that leads me to this year's topic, which is still NGSSifying my class, but I'm calling it part 2. I basically completely overhauled my curriculum. I took what I've learned over the last 3 years and went all the way implementing it into my medical science classes. It was basically one giant aha moment for me where everything kind of came together, and I implemented so much of what I've learned into my class. So overall, I'm really proud of everything I was able to do with my students and how I've grown as a teacher. So my research question this year specifically was, how does teaching using the NGSS framework and using team building protocols promote student participation in my classroom? So yes, I was using the NGSS standards, but I was also building in team building protocols, and I was specifically looking at, do I get equal participation in my class? A little bit of background information that I looked at was, of course, the NGSS standards, but also, as I said, I just took everything I've learned over the last 3 years through professional development and basically implemented it in my classroom. So going to conferences, including the NSTA conference, going to workshops and trainings such as the CERT training, reading books, including helping students make sense of the world using NGSS science and engineering practices. The SEPs was something I focused specifically on. And actually, from this book, I found a quote that I thought really pertained to my research topic. The quote is, "These science and engineering practices create a need for designing our classrooms as places in which students are working together to share ideas and reach consensus as a classroom community. This the shift to practices highlights the importance of working with one another to build and debate knowledge, adding social interaction and classroom discourse to what students need to learn as they participate in scientific sense-making." So I really connected with the idea of social interaction, classroom discourse with each other to help them make sense of the science that they were learning. So my research methods, a little bit of background about my school. The school name is Health Professions High School, so we focus on healthcare as a theme. We focus on getting kids prepared for both college and career. We're a small school, so a total of 220 students. I teach the 60 freshmen, all 60 freshmen that go to our school. The class that I teach is basic anatomy and physiology class. It's called medical science. 86% of our students are on free or reduced lunch, and they're mostly from underserved communities. So as I said before, I completely restructured my curriculum, and I specifically made sure that not only including the NGSS standards, but that I included team building protocols and dialogue protocols to get them to really interact with each other to help them make sense of the science that they were learning. So there were 4 practices that I made sure I put into every single unit that I taught throughout the year. The first one is some type of scientific reading, such as this one on blood typing. I also included some type of scientific data, whether it was looking at graphs and charts or looking at infographics and analyzing that information. The third one was changing my labs and making sure that they were all CER format, so claim, evidence, reasoning. And then the last one that I made sure I had in every unit was some type of PQM model where they saw a phenomenon, they made observations, noticings, wonderings, and then they created their own questions and investigations based off of that. So I focused on one specific unit, although this is an example of how I did all of my units last year. The way I first created it was to start with 30 seconds of me. I reshuffled them into new groups for each unit. So when they're new groups, the first thing they did was introduce themselves, shake each other's hands, 30 seconds to say whatever they wanted to say about them. I think, Jay, you were the one that first recommended that, so thank you. And then they went into a team building activity that was not just fun and games. You see all kinds of team builders that are all just, yay, play with stuff, and they don't really take home any real team building message. So I made sure to include debrief. The debrief part of it is so important. They talked about what they were taking out of that team builder and that they could apply to the future in working with their groups. So they did some introductory activities. I also, at first I assigned a group facilitator for every group, and then later I had them choose or nominate themselves to be the group facilitator. This I got from last summer's SacMAST-L Summer Institute, where we talked about what does a group facilitator do, basically keeping the group on track, and that worked really well too, to make sure that groups were working well together. And then I designed my model statements, the statements that I wanted students to be able to come up with. Could also kind of be phrased as learning targets or outcomes for each part of the unit. And I tried to put this in kid-friendly language. And then as we went through the lessons, the students were coming up with these on their own. Then I went into the lesson development where I put all the specifics about what I'm going to do each day. And I have the little columns on the right, the 4 practices that I wanted to make sure I incorporated at least one into every unit. So I was holding myself accountable for doing that, right? Did they have some kind of reading? Did they look at some kind of data? Did they do a CER? And did they do a PQM? So the example that I'm showing you is called the heart transplant surgery. I'm just going to quickly talk through the subunits. It kind of makes the overall storyline just so you get an idea of what the unit was about. So the first step was basically, what do you do when you actually have a patient who needs a heart transplant? You have to decide who gets the heart, who gets the transplant. So we talked about bioethics and how the actual medical community decides who actually receives the transplant. Then we went into prepping your patient for surgery. We looked at sterile technique in the hospital systems and microorganisms and the spread of disease. And then you put your patient to sleep for the surgery. So we looked at anesthetics, how they work, pain, how pain is perceived in the brain. And then you actually do your transplant surgery with your patient. So that was when we did the heart dissection. They engineered an artificial heart in their groups. They looked at understanding how blood flows through the heart, the anatomy of the heart. And then in most transplant surgeries, you need some type of blood transfusion. So we talked about blood and blood typing and the importance of compatibility with blood typing. Then you stitch your patient up. So they learned how to do stitching using real pig's feet and real suturing material. I actually had my juniors and seniors come in and teach them, because in the past, doctors had come to our school to train those students. So then they're kind of training each other, which is pretty cool. And then I throw a wrench in it, and there's some type of medical mistake that happens, and how is that dealt with in the real world with lawsuits and accountability for the medical field. So that was the overall unit, the one that I specifically looked at. As I mentioned, they were in groups throughout the entire year. Groups of 3, I think, is ideal. I specifically made sure that I embedded community building activities throughout the year and dialogue protocols throughout the year, again, in hopes of increasing participation. Remember, my research question was on, does the NGSS standards and community building and dialogue protocols and communication increase student participation? Do we have more equal participation amongst our students? So examples of team building and community building, I'm going to go through those first of how I incorporated that, and then I'll talk about the communication protocols. So as I mentioned before, there was a team building exercise at the beginning of every unit with a debrief, which I feel is important. Every day they had a community question as a part of their opener. So I put a card on every group's desk, and they had to answer a question as a group out loud. And then each student had to write down a different student's answer, so that they were answering it out loud and listening to each other and writing down each other's answers, just as a way of getting them to get to know each other a little bit more. So examples of questions on those cards included, if you could be a character in any book, who would you be and why? What are some things you think people should say more often? I got some interesting responses on that one. And describe your idea of a perfect day. I included all kinds of dialogue protocols, including talking sticks, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and reading protocols too. So for the dialogue and the reading protocols, they were meant to get students to think about things individually first, and then communicate with their team to help them process, and then communicate with the class as a whole. As I mentioned before, group facilitators, I use that to help the groups, again, build community and work as a team. I had doodle sheets so that students could process on their own before sharing out loud in their groups and sharing out loud to the whole class. And then I had them reflect every day. They had to fill out their own scores on how well they did with the quality of their work. Were they engaged? Did they follow classroom policies? Were they participating? Were they polite to each other? Were they following the electronic policies? And were they being distracting to others? So that was kind of a daily reflection just to get them to remember the kinds of things that they needed to be working on. I also periodically had them create weekly goals that they would write on sticky notes and put somewhere on their desk so that they'd be able to see it. And then I asked them to reflect on were they able to meet those goals at the end of the week. They also did reflections on how they worked as a group and as a team at the end of every unit. So the dialogue protocols, the communication skills that I tried to build in includes talking sticks to incorporate all students to make sure that everyone's voice is heard before everyone has a chance to just kind of have free speech in round 3 where they could just talk. I also included some reading jigsaws where they each learned different information that they then had to take back to the team and communicate with their team. We did think, pair, shares, which I know you were all familiar with, and a lot of group brainstorming where they had to work together to just come up with all kinds of ideas that they would write on the whiteboards and we would talk about as a class. I also used something called Paraphrase Passport, where before one student could speak, they had to paraphrase what the person before them had said to make sure not only that they were listening, but also to make sure that they understood that person correctly. So learning how to paraphrase each other. And then the last one was sketchnoting. Thanks, Jay, for recommending that. I love sketchnoting now. I had them work in pairs where one person would read out loud and the other person would sketch it out. And then they would switch places paragraph by paragraph. So this is an example of the reading on blood typing and how they actually were able to illustrate that. So those were the types of things that I built into my curriculum. The data. So again, I'm looking at, are my students equally participating in class? And the types of data that I used was basically 2 main types. Classroom observations that I was observing the groups, and then student surveys for feedback from individual students. So my results. So I'm going to start with the classroom observations. There were 5 activities on 5 different days that I was observing my group. So the first activity was when they were engineering their artificial hearts as a group. Before they could start the activity, they had to talk as a group and make a plan and come up with what are they going to do before they could just jump into playing with the materials. So for each class period, I watched one group from each class for about 4 or 5 minutes total. And I just marked down every time a student spoke. I just tallied up how many times did each student speak from that group. So in first period, there was a total of 41 interactions. Of those 41 interactions, the first student interacted 39% of the time. The second student was 27% of the time. And the third student was 34% of the time. So ideally, this would look like a perfect peace sign with 33% all around. I thought it came pretty close. So again, we're looking at how much does each student participate in their group discussion as a team. Second period, same thing, different group, 37%, 26%, and 37%. And then the last period, 41%, 18%, and 41%. So this was the one that was probably off the most. The second student there that only participated 18% of the time. I can say that she's always engaged, but just more of a quiet student. But overall, I would say that there was pretty even discussion, which made me happy. The second activity was on, they were using manipulatives to figure out how blood flows through the heart. Before they did that, though, there was a short couple paragraph reading assignment. I give out the assignment with no intention of having them work as a group for that part of it. but without my prompting at all, most of the groups started doing it together. So the bar that says synchronous represents how many groups were working synchronously at the same time together, reading it out loud and answering the questions together. They were all on the same question, writing it down, waiting for each other. Nobody was getting ahead or falling behind. So there was a total of 19 groups, and 13 of them were just beautifully working together. The remaining 6, 2 of those groups were off. They were asynchronous, meaning somebody got behind or ahead or wasn't following along. But with one prompt from me, they got back on track and then they were fine. And then there were 4 groups that just worked on their own throughout the entire time. But I was pretty impressed with the fact that I initially hadn't even prompted anyone, and they were just so used to working in groups and teams that they just automatically started doing that. Same thing with the reading jigsaw assignment. I reshuffled teams into different groups where they were to read different materials, bring that information back to their group. When I reshuffled the groups, these new groups started automatically reading out loud. I hadn't really even thought about that. I just wanted to get them the information to take back with their groups. But 4 of the 6 groups started reading out loud automatically. This was only for my first period class, because after I saw that, I realized for second and third period, I should encourage students to read out loud with each other. So I didn't want that to affect my data. The next activity was a reading summary protocol, where one student from the group would read this paragraph out loud, and then the other 2 had to respond by summarizing it, and then everyone wrote down the summary together. So I was looking at, again, were all groups fully participating, no one was getting behind, everyone was on track. In first period, of the 6 groups, 4 of them worked beautifully. 2 of them had one student that was either not writing down the summary, or there was a group where a student was getting ahead and just kind of working on their own. Second period, of the 7 groups, only 1 group wasn't fully participating, but that was because they were kind of confused about the directions, and then I explained and they were fine. Third period, every group worked beautifully. The next example was neuron transmission. So students always have a hard time understanding how neuron transmission works, so I thought I would have them explain it out loud in their groups, and they used the whiteboards to illustrate their explanations, and then as they were explaining it to their group members could interrupt if they had questions, or to try to help them if there was something that they saw that their student was explaining wrong. So I had 43 total students. Of those 43, during this activity, 41 were actively trying to understand and explain and help each other. There were only 2 students in all of my classes that were checked out and not participating or not doing it. And I also saw a lot of students just being really kind with each other and really patient with each other and really trying to make sure that they understood it, which was really cool to see. Okay, so those were classroom observations. Second half of my data was on student surveys, where I asked them to give me feedback individually. The first one was an open-ended question, and I just said, overall, describe how well you and your group members worked together as a team. This was for the heart transplant unit. And then I took their open-ended responses and I categorized it into, were they all positive, partly positive, or negative? So an example of an all positive response was, I think we all did a good job at contributing and making sure everyone talked or shared. An example of a partly positive response was, we all worked together, but we did all bump heads sometimes. And then an example of a negative response was, not good. Luckily, there was only 4.5% that were negative, 77% were all positive, and 18.2% were partly positive, which overall I was pretty pleased with that. Another question I asked was, how much did each student in your group contribute overall? And we had talked about this throughout the year. We always talk about a 1 to 7 scale. If you're a 1, you're not participating at all or hardly at all. You're not talking, you're not contributing, you need to step it up. If you're a 7, you're talking too much, you're hogging the floor, you're not giving other people a chance, so you need to step back. So we talk a lot about step up and step back. 4 is where you want to be, right? Just right in the middle. So I asked each student to rate their group members and themselves at the end. And as you can see, ideally they would all be 4s, but still I was pretty happy with the majority that were 4, or if not, they tended to err on the too much side. There was very few who thought that their teammates contributed not enough. The next portion, I did a 1 to 4 scale, how much you agree or disagree with each of the following statements. I used to do a 1 to 5 scale. But Senna helped me out with the idea that a 1 to 5 scale leaves room for a 3 response, which doesn't really give you as a researcher much information. You don't really know is that a positive response? Is that a negative response? So I kept it 1 to 4, and then I categorized my 3s and 4s as basically meaning they agree, and my 1s and 2s is basically meaning that they disagree. So the first question was, I feel that my team members have listened to me and my ideas. 91%. These are 14-year-old freshmen. 91% thought that their team members listened to them. That's a win for me. The next question was, the community questions during the openers have helped me get to know my team members. On that one, 84% agreed and 16% disagreed. I'm comfortable talking with my team. 75% agreed, 25% disagreed. And again, for 14-year-olds, feeling comfortable at any time, again, 75%, I'll take it. The next question was, I feel like a valuable member of my team. 78% agreed, 22% disagreed. And my favorite question, I'm proud of the work that I've done with my team. 91% of my kids were proud of the work that they did, which I think also speaks volumes. This is purely anecdotal, but I had to share. One day I was absent with a sub, and we all know when you're absent with a sub, you come back, the dreaded sub note. What are they going to say? What am I going to have to deal with the next day? This note said, thank you for having me cover your classes today. 99.9% of your students were great. They were on task and polite. It's so nice having a smaller class size. You can really see students working together. You have a great group of students. I'd be happy to sub for you again. So I zoned in on the, wow, a sub could see that my students were working together, and I thought that was important. So conclusions overall, I would say, again, I'm really proud of the work I did this year, of everything kind of coming together. I think overall it really did work. Let's see. So I had increased participation this year. I could just feel it even anecdotally. Working in teams and using the communication protocols and NGSSifying more of my curriculum. There was a lot less complaining and whining about group members or hesitancy to share out loud or to work in teams that I usually see in the past. It basically became a way of life in my classroom that they were expected to work in these groups. It was just the way that we did things. It kind of became a natural norm, which was really cool. And my question, going back to my research question again, which was, how does teaching using the NGSS framework and using team building protocols promote student equity in my classroom? I would say participation in discussions was a lot more equal. And again, my students reported feeling more heard and being more valued by their team members, which was also really neat. There's the however, though, right? However, there's some factors that could have skewed my results. First of all, I had an amazing group of kids. This is probably the best group of students I've ever worked with in my entire teaching career when it comes to classroom behaviors and managing behaviors. So their personalities were generally just more laid back. They got along really well. Also, I had very small class sizes, 12 to 20 students total, and we all know how much of a difference that can make. So I do know that probably skewed some things, but again, overall, I still feel that the way I organize my curriculum really helped as well. So moving forward, I'd like to look more specifically at the SEPs, each of them, and kind of grade myself on how well do I provide opportunities for students and how much am I teaching each of those skills. And I'm considering that maybe as a topic for my next action research project. So thank you so much for listening. I appreciate any comments or questions that you may have.